Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Farah Al-Nabulsi. I'm a special counsel at KNL Gates in Dubai office.
And my name is Zaid, and I'm corporate associate also in the Dubai office of KNL Gates. And Farah and I are going to walk you today through a VC term sheet and talk about some of the main provisions and considerations that you should be aware of when it comes to a VC term sheet. We hope you find this session helpful, and if you have any questions, please make a note of those, add them to the Q&A section on Zoom, or send them on the chat, and we'll address those at the end of the session. Before we get started, just a quick disclaimer as the slide says. The presentation is not intended to provide you with legal advice and cover every single matter or issue that you should consider when it comes to VC term sheets. We really recommend that you engage your legal advisors, as they'll be able to provide you with tailored advice that's specific to your own unique transaction.
Okay, so I think I'm just going to hold this to make sure that everybody can hear me. So before we get started, we'll just walk you through the agenda for today. So we are going to be discussing in high level what is a term sheet, and then we're going to take you through the venture capital timeline and briefly discuss if the term sheet is intended to be binding or not. And afterwards, we're going to walk you through the structure of VC term sheet, and then we're going to give you top tips to leave you with that and open the floor for any questions that you may have. So let's get started. In this section, we're going to be discussing what is the term sheet, and we're going to be talking about the different references that you can find when somebody is referring to a document that is essentially a term sheet. When would you be using a term sheet, you as an entrepreneur? When will you be seeing it? And what would a term sheet look like, and why would you need to use a term sheet? So to get started, a term sheet is your preliminary document, initial document that you're going to be seeing. It's not intended to be a binding document, but it sets out your key terms and principles upon which you're going to be starting your negotiation process and hopefully end up with a binding investment agreement or an SPA. The different references that you might find for a term sheet can be heads of terms, HOT, LOI, letter of intent, MOU, memorandum of understanding, heads of agreement, HOA. All these are intended to refer to the same thing, which is essentially the term sheet. For today's workshop, we're going to be using the term sheet throughout, but keep in mind that it can be referred to in different terminology. In terms of when would the term sheet be used, a term sheet can be used in different. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. So the term sheet can be used as part of different contexts. So it can be used as part of mergers and acquisitions transaction, an M&A transaction, a venture capital, VC, which is what we're going to be talking about today, a financing arrangement, or even a more complex commercial arrangement. For your purposes, you need to keep in mind that a term sheet will continue to be relevant throughout the life cycle of your company, whether that is at a very early stage where you're trying to convince your friends and family to invest in your company, and that would be called the angel investors or the seed round, or at a later stage where you're still an early stage startup and you're trying to convince the first VC firm to invest in you. And that would be the Series A, Series B, or later on where you're expanding and you're getting more and more investment. At each round of investment, you would be expected to deal with a term sheet. Whether you're going to be drafting it or receiving it really depends. But something to keep in mind that the term sheet will always be relevant to you. What would a term sheet look like? And here we need to look at it, is it a VC term sheet or a general term sheet? So if it's a non-VC related term sheet, it really can be as simple as one page, and it can go as complex and comprehensive to a few pages with annexes, etc. But for your purposes, for a VC term sheet, it usually is a simple document, a bullet point kind of form that would be given to you by the VC firm. So really, there's no specific standard form per se. And then we're going to be moving to why would you need to use a term sheet. So your term sheet is really the preliminary document, as we said, that will set out the key principles upon which the investor is willing to invest in your company. It will have the key important terms. For your purposes, you're going to be needing it as your written confirmation that would set up these main agreed terms. It could help you, and it can be used as a tool from the beginning to know if there is a deal or no deal, because it's very common for people to think they want the same things until they start translating it and putting it into a written document. And that's where people start to think, oh, not really, this is not what I had in mind. So it could be a tool for you to know if there's a deal or no deal, if you are far apart or you are closer and there are few points to negotiate. And it also can be a good document or a good tool to flush out any ambiguities. And a properly drafted term sheet would really help you and make it easier at a later stage to translate these terms into a properly comprehensive legal document. So a properly drafted term sheet will make it easier for your lawyers in the future to translate it into a binding agreement. Therefore, you should keep in mind that the term sheet should be plain, should be simple, should be straightforward. If something doesn't make sense to you, it probably doesn't make sense. So don't be afraid to ask a question and get clarification and make it as simple as possible. Another use for the term sheet is to outline the timetable and the next steps, corresponding obligations of the parties. And this can be a very useful tool once you sign the term sheet to have an agenda of what we're trying to do until we reach into our final definitive agreement. Another use for the term sheet is to be a framework for the initial binding obligations that you would expect to see in a term sheet. And these mainly are related to exclusivity, confidentiality, any arrangement around costs and expenses, and also if you want to identify the governing law and dispute resolution mechanism. So, having said that, and having given you some kind of a feel of what is a term sheet, for your purposes, when would you expect to see and negotiate a term sheet? So in order to give you more flavor of that, we thought it would be helpful to remind you or tell you about the venture capital timeline. So to start with, the first phase would be for you to start up with your startup formation. And that essentially is the time that you will formulate the idea or the concept of your startup. That's the time where you would be hiring your core team, filing your IP, and just bringing it all together. And at that point, you would be ready to start pitching your idea for VC firms and lining up initial meetings if you're lucky. And at that stage, you would be standing before VC firms, you're going to be defending your idea, you're going to be selling your company as a concept, what you do, and how your idea matters. So it's essentially a roadshow to market what you have been up to. And if the VC firm is convinced and interested, they will start investing more and more in understanding more what you're trying to do. And that can be by setting more meetings and follow-ups, putting you in touch with the more senior partners in the VC firm that would make the decision. They might also start preliminary due diligence, technical due diligence, financial due diligence, but they're not going to be investing heavily at the beginning until they know this is an idea worth taking forward. So when the investors look at the idea, have a couple of meetings with you, they're going to be saying yes or no. If it's a no, it stops here and you will not reach the term sheet point. But if it's a yes, that's where more due diligence will be conducted, that's where more meetings will be carried out, and if everything goes well, you will move forward to receiving a draft term sheet from the VC firm. At that stage, you will be you'll be revising or receiving this draft term sheet, you'll be negotiating it, and hopefully you'll be signing your term sheet. Once you sign this term sheet, as I said, you will have certain timeline and certain obligations you're required to follow. and that's where your agenda starts ticking off. And that would lead you eventually to the documentation stage, where the due diligence will be more comprehensive. A due diligence report will be produced, and it essentially covers technical aspects, financial aspects, legal aspects. The investor will raise certain questions for you to address and clarify, you and your team. And at that point, you will start also discussing and drafting the definitive binding document, which will essentially be an investment agreement or a share purchase agreement, depends. So that is your documentation phase. And if everything goes well, hopefully you'll sign, you close, and you'll receive the cash, and you'll, go and party. So after giving you this overview about what is a term sheet, when can you use it, why is it important, I have touched upon whether a term sheet is binding or not. You need to keep in mind that a term sheet is not intended to be binding, but if you are not careful to make sure that the terms that are not binding are clearly expressed not to be binding, you might find yourself in a position where your term sheet can become binding. So it's very important. Keep in mind, a term sheet shouldn't, or it's not intended to be binding. Certain provisions will have to be binding, which we'll come to. And that's why, from your perspective, it is very important to have a very clear language saying this term sheet is not a binding legal document, except for clause XYZ, which are related to blah, blah, blah. Don't rely on terms that are ambiguous. Don't rely on subject to contract, for instance, because this is a term of art that is familiar, like it's known and familiar in English law, but not necessarily in other jurisdictions. So you do not want to rely on kind of ambiguous or terms that can imply or not imply binding effect of the term sheet. So now, after having said that the term sheet is not intended to be binding, certain provisions, as I said, are or have to be binding to safeguard some of your rights and some of the investors' rights. And these are essentially the exclusivity obligations. So the investor would expect you to have a no-shop period, which essentially means the time that you are talking with the VC firm, they would want to make sure that you are not trying to pitch your idea for other investors. A key word on this: exclusivity is something that is very common in term sheets, but you want to be clear about what is the scope of the exclusivity, when does it start, and when does it end. Is there any formality for it to end, or by the expiry of the term it ends automatically? These starting points, end points are very important for you to keep in mind and keep it very clear. Another clause that you will want to have it as a binding clause is dispute resolution and governing law. And when we're talking about dispute resolution, just keep in mind that when you are entering into a term sheet, everybody's happy, everybody's aligned, everybody's in agreement. But you want to count for that potential possibility that the situation is not the same, you're not in line anymore, and you have a dispute. You would want to agree in advance how this dispute will be resolved. And that's why it's important to include a dispute resolution provision. Which court should be hearing this? Or is it mediation? Is it arbitration? Things like that you should keep in mind. And also the governing law. Because when you're talking about governing law, there's the governing law for this term sheet and also the governing law that will follow in the transactional documents. And also think about where your company is. Because the governing law would help you understand if certain provisions are practically enforceable, and it would also be helpful for you to know which provisions you should push on and insist on having, and which ones you can live without, or assess that, well, yeah, it's not really enforceable in this jurisdiction, so maybe we can leave it. But again, this is something you have to do alongside your legal advisor, because it's not easy for you to know that. Another provision that is also important to be binding is costs related and expenses. So if there's an arrangement between you and the investor that certain costs will be borne equally, or the investor will cover certain expenses, you want to make sure that this is also included in a binding clause. The last clause that we would usually find and see as binding, and which is also important for you and for your purposes as an entrepreneur, is the confidentiality clause. So if you haven't signed an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, at the beginning or at the outset of your discussions with the investor, the term sheet is the time where you should impose the confidentiality obligation and the non-disclosures. And we say that because, as I mentioned, you are going to be opening your books, you're going to be explaining and providing the VC firm with some sensitive information, some confidential information as part of the due diligence, which would help them make the decision to invest in your company or not. But at the same time, if things do not go forward, you want to make sure that all these information, all this trade secrets maybe, are safeguarded and are covered under a confidentiality agreement that is binding. So these are the key points. And I'll now move to Zaid to walk you through the structure of a VC term sheet and some of the common terms that you will find, so that it's familiar to you when it's time.
Thanks for that, Farah. So now that we've talked about what a term sheet is, what it looks like, what are some of the binding clauses that should be included, I'm going to talk to you about some of the key sections that you'll probably find in a VC term sheet. And I'll mention 4 key ones, and those are the offering terms, the operative terms, terms relating to the shareholders agreement and the SPA, the stock of share purchase agreement, and finally other provisions or boilerplates. In the first section, relating to the offering terms, you'll find information about basically what's happening and who's getting what. You'll find information on the investors, their details, the amount that's going to be raised from the investment round, the price per share and pre-money valuation, which is the value of the company before the investment is made. You'll also find information about the post-money valuation, which is the value of the company pre-money plus the newly raised financing in the investment round. There'll also be a mention of any new classes of preferred shares that are going to be issued, and the name of the preferred shares will reflect the investment rounds. For example, it might be Series A preferred shares. And you'll also see some notes on whether on the rights that attach to the preferred shares, and those rights can be in relation to investment protection, liquidation, and dividends. And typically, preferred shares supersede the rights of common shares that are held by common shareholders. And common shareholders, as you may know, are those, the founders, maybe people from the consulting team or the core team who hold those common shares. So the next section would be the operative terms, and here you'll find a bit more of the technical terms, such as the dividend policy, and that will set out the amount that dividends are paid, the timing, and the cumulative nature of dividends. You'll also probably see some information on the liquidation preference. And the liquidation preference gives the investor the option to either receive the liquidation preference or convert their preferred shares into common shares. And these are the amounts that the company must pay at exit to the investor. And this clause is usually really important to a VC investor, and will probably want to have it clearly set out in a term sheet, so that the understanding of both parties is clear from the outset. And there are 2 common types of liquidation preference in venture capital that I'm going to briefly mention, and that's the non-participating preference and the participating preference. And in the non-participating preference, this is pretty straightforward, as the liquidation preference will be calculated based on the investment amount multiplied by a liquidation multiple that's agreed between the parties from the outset. In the participating preference, the investor will kind of have 2 options here. Either they'll receive their liquidation preference and then share in the proceeds on a pro rata basis, and this is also known as double dipping. Or the other option is to have a capped participation, which means the investor will share in the liquidation proceeds on a pro rata basis until the proceeds reach an agreed multiple of the initial investment. Again, these are a bit technical, so we're not going to go into a lot of details. But just to make a point that it's important to make sure you understand which options being applied, consult with your financial advisors or your finance team, and just make sure the understanding between the parties is clearly set out in relation to this point. Next, there'll be the anti-dilution protection measures that are mentioned, and these clauses are built into convertible preferred shares that are issued to the VC investors, and basically the purpose is to protect them, to protect their investment from losing value when the company goes through a subsequent investment round. And there are usually, again, two types of anti-dilution clauses, or at least two types that I'm going to mention here. And the first one is the full ratchet provision, and the second is the weighted average provision. In the full ratchet provision, this allows the lowest sale price as the adjusted option price for existing early stage investors. For example, if the original investor if the original conversion price of an early investor was set at $5, and in a subsequent investment round, the conversion price that was granted was $2.50, then the investor's original conversion price would be adjusted from $5 to $2.50. In the weighted average provision, this basically uses the standard formula that's agreed to determine the new conversion price of the original investor following a subsequent investment round, and when a new conversion price is agreed at the subsequent investment round. In this first section, you'll also see information on the pay-to-play provision, and this provision basically means that an investor must continue to pay and financially support the investor in order to make use of the preferred share rights that they enjoy. And it's actually a beneficial clause to have because it kind of sets the tone from the beginning and informs the investors that they are expected to continue to support financially or otherwise the startup. And if they don't, they may risk losing the rights attached to their preferred shares or have their preferred shares converted into common shares. So that was the first section. The second section in relation to the share purchase agreement or the stock purchase agreement and the shareholders agreement, you'll see a couple of terms here, and one of them is in relation to the conditions precedent, or CPs for short. And these are conditions that usually have to be satisfied before an investor is bound by a certain subsequent obligation. And generally speaking, CPs are included to cover the conclusion of a satisfactory legal, financial, and in some cases a technical due diligence exercise. And they may also be subject to any customer references that need to be provided, satisfactory customer references. And what is considered satisfactory in relation to the customer references or the due diligence exercises is up to the investor and their discretion. In this section, you also see terms in relation to rights of first refusal, provisions in relation to co-sale agreement, and in relation to rights of first refusal, these are provisions that give the company and the investor the option to purchase shares that are being sold or offered to a third party, or the option to purchase those shares before they are offered to a third party. And in a co-sale agreement, it basically gives the right for a group of shareholders to also sell their shares when another group of shareholders is selling theirs under the same terms and conditions that have been agreed. Drag-along rights, as many of you may know, these are rights that are contained in the constitutional documents of a company, whereby a majority of the shareholders that accept an offer to buy their shares will require and force the holders of the remaining minority shareholders to also accept the offer to buy their shares. Next, though, you might see some lockup provisions, and I'm going to mention two here. There's the lockup agreement and the founder lockup. In the lockup agreement, it's basically an agreement that's an obligation placed on the investor not to sell their shares for a specific period of time. In the founder lockup, it's a similar principle, but in this case, it's the founders that's restricted from selling their shares, and the purpose is to make sure that they're bound to their startup, to their company. You also maybe see terms in relation to an employee stock option plan or stock option program, or ESOP for short, and the information set here probably talks about how the program is handled, its size, how it's who supports it financially, and how. And there may be some terms in relation to an expectation that future investors will be required to support any expansion of ESOPs. And the size of an ESOP will really depend on the size of the startup, how mature it is, how many employees it has. You might see some representation in warranties, and although a comprehensive list of reps and warranties are probably going to be found in the SPA following due diligence exercise, you may see some key reps and warranties here, regardless of what the outcome of the due diligence or the DD exercise is. And as any investors, they probably want to keep an eye on how the company is doing, and they'll probably want to draft in some measures that they can exercise to do so, and that can either be through agreeing a list of reserved matters, and these are matters that are probably set out in the shareholders agreement and which would require the prior written consent or the affirmative vote of the investor. And really the reserved matters are those that probably have a direct or a significant impact on the management and operation and costs of the company. And as an example, it may be some of the reserved matters may be those relating to any changes to the Articles of Association, any changes to the capital expenditure, changes to the contracts of the management's services, and so on, and any acquisitions or disposals. Another way that an investor will probably want to have in a term sheet to make sure they are involved and have an idea of what's happening at the startup is through the board of directors. And there are several options here. They can either require a right to appoint a member of the board of directors from their own internal team. They may want to appoint an independent third party to be the board member, or they may just want to have an observer attend the board meetings, and those are known as observer rights. And again, the purpose is to be involved, to make sure that the company is running, according to what their expectations are. Finally, you probably see a requirement on the company to provide the investor with sufficiently detailed financial information and supporting documents during the investment period, and that may either be by way of management accounts or cash flow forecasts. And the final section that I'm going to mention relates to some of the other provisions and boilerplates that you see in the term sheet. And just a note on boilerplates, yeah, they're boilerplates and you probably come across them in different contracts. Doesn't mean you shouldn't pay attention to them and make sure they work for your term sheet and they fit your purposes. So keep an eye out on those and engage a lawyer if anything is unclear. And like Farah mentioned, just make sure the clauses that you want to be binding are clearly set out as binding, whether it's in relation to exclusivity, confidentiality, clause, governing law, jurisdiction, and so on. And the final keynote that I want to make is in relation to the term or the validity or the life of the term sheet. If the parties want to have an option to extend the term of the term sheet, that should be clearly set out in the term sheet. It's also important to know who can ask for an extension, who needs to approve any extension. Do both parties have to approve any extension to the term? And if the term of the term sheet is in fact extended, make sure you note any knock-on effects that may have on any other provisions, such as the exclusivity provision. If the term's extended, you might want to extend the exclusivity as well. As Farah mentioned, there is no standard form venture capital term sheet. Some term sheet may look alike, but the important thing to remember is it needs to fit your purposes. It needs to accurately reflect your understanding and your agreement with the investor. And whenever in doubt, no matter how small the uncertainty is, reach out to a lawyer so that they can help you make sure your rights and your understandings are accurately protected and reflected.
All right. So now moving to the final bits, which is we call them TikToks. Top tips, actually. As we mentioned, get a lawyer, get legal advice. The investor is not your friend. The lawyer of your investor is not your lawyer. If the investor says, I'll cover your legal costs, make sure they cover your legal costs by ways of dispersing you for whatever you spend, not by them appointing your lawyer or telling you, oh, well, you know what, you can use our in-house lawyer or you can use our external lawyer. So be very clear about your legal support and who's going to be providing you with the advice. This is the first one. The second tip that we would want to leave with you is to reconsider the governing law, where your company is. Whether these provisions that you're putting, right of first refusal, drag along, all these things, you need to understand from a practical point of view, are they enforceable? And if they're not, just assess the risk on that basis. And you can only do that with your legal advisor. Another thing. Lastly, actually, the third one is the term sheet will set the tone. We did mention that the term sheet is not intended to be binding, except for those clauses that you emphasize they are binding. But still, whatever is in the term sheet will most likely, or like 99% of the time, be available or be there in your definitive final agreement. You will expand on it, you will negotiate it a bit further, but it will not disappear. And it will be used as an argument. Why are you adding this? It wasn't in the term sheet. Why are you removing this? It was not in the term sheet. So be very careful. Whatever is in the term sheet will stay with you. If you want to include something that is very important, make sure you discuss it and include it in the term sheet, because it's very, very difficult to introduce or remove something that was agreed to in the outset, even though it was not binding. But this is from a pure, practical, commercial perspective. Another thing to keep in mind is to include worked examples. If you feel there's a concept that is not easy to comprehend, you will try to put it in plain English. You will try to simplify it, but go the extra mile and actually put an example. If you are not clear about anti-dilution and how it's being dealt with, or if you feel it's complicated or the language does not really reflect 100% what you have in mind, why don't you put an example? But make sure your example is correct, your calculation is correct, and your formula is correct. Because the last thing you want is to put a worked example that confuses everything that the text has. And as Zaid said, when in doubt, ask the question. You are not a guru in your VC. You are negotiating with a VC firm. They are more sophisticated than you. There's no shame in asking. There's no shame in telling them, oh, if this is what you meant, why don't we write it this way? Don't rely on sophisticated, complex legal language that doesn't make sense to you. Keep that in mind throughout your negotiations of the term sheet, and even when you have your investment agreement, the SPA. The more clear the language is, the less ambiguities you're going to have in the future, and hopefully less disputes. So with that, we conclude our presentation. We just want to see if there are questions that we can address.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section or in the chat box.
A copy of the presentation, I think we can circulate that. Yeah, absolutely. If anybody has any question, we are here and we're waiting. But if you want to ask questions later on, we're also going to be...
Yeah, we'll put up our contact details on the slide.
Yeah.
Over there in the slide, so we'll circulate.
Yeah, please do feel free to reach out to us either directly or through the FinTech, DIFC FinTech Hive, if you have any questions you would like to know more about.
Thank you for having us. It was our pleasure.
Thank you everyone for attending with in-person digitally as well.
Thanks everyone and good luck.
Thank you. Yeah, good luck with the negotiations.